circulated to the members by email. I had identified a couple of minor corrections, which I had shared with the clerk. I assume those have been made. So, can I move for the adoption of the minutes? Yes, Member.
I hope the minor correction, Chairman, included a spelling of the ministry with 2 M's on one of the pages, as indicated in the email, that this was the corrected version of the minutes. I'm trying to find the page in the hard copy. And for easier flow.
What page are you on?
I'm trying to find it, Chairman. I think it probably would be on page 5 of this one, based on where I read it in the email. Anyway, that's a minor point, but subject to that, I think there's just one other point. As it relates to page 2, I know the attendance here is indicated at the front, but in the second paragraph, we just jumped to Mrs. Blake without saying who she was. So for easier flow from the Ministry of Finance, because the first paragraph dealt with Mrs. Monroe Ellis. Right.
Page 2?
Yes, sorry, my apologies. Page 4.
Oh.
Second paragraph, my apologies. It just jumped to Mrs. Blake, so just for easier flow, we could say from the Ministry of Finance. Although on the first page, we had the attendance record as to who Mrs. Blake was.
No objection to that? Can we just agree to do that?
Having said that, so moved, Chairman.
Thank you. Seconded by, I think, Member Phillips. All in favor? All right, great. So the minutes have been approved. Matters arising? Any matters arising? No matters arising? There being no matters arising, we will proceed. The agenda has the next item as an A under matters arising. I'm not sure that's correct, because I think it's a separate substantive item. It's really the business of the day, isn't it? Yeah, so we could just note that correction with the agenda. So the next item is the review of the accounts of the Ministry of Finance and Public Service for the Accountant General's Department. We were furnished with the usual prompt by the Auditor General's Department. An updated prompt was received very late yesterday evening and circulated to members this morning by the clerk, who bemoaned the fact that she'd already made all the copies of the previous version. And so I'm just going to implore the department to try to conclude any adjustments to prompts at least 48 hours before the meeting, all right? Because for one thing, nobody having read a prompt wants to reread it again to try and identify what changes have been made, and they're not highlighted. So it's really difficult. If we'd love to have the documentation settled at least 48 hours before the meeting, so that we can read and prepare and not think that we're going to be reading something that will be subsequently updated. Having said that, we thank the department for the prompt, which as usual is very helpful. And we'll move straight into it. And I would just ask if the Auditor General would just give us her opening remarks on the report and the issues that have been raised.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, everyone. All right, as you have indicated, you received an updated prompt yesterday, and we're really just trying to facilitate the Accountant General who provided us with evidence yesterday. But what you will see from the prompt is that a significant amount of the issues would have either been flagged as satisfied, meaning that we're satisfied with the response, or keep in view that we find the response satisfactory, but the evidence is not readily available, and so we will be monitoring the issue to ensure that the steps are taken as indicated or promised by the Accountant General. So, Chair, the committee is at liberty to ask questions in relation to those matters flagged as keep in view. Keep in view means that I have no immediate interest in the matter. So there are only 3 items that would be flagged as outstanding. The first is in relation to the appropriation accounts, which is item 3.2.89. Sorry, it's not 89, 3.2.75. And that's pertaining to the outstanding appropriation accounts. The second matter relates to statement F, which is an issue that was brought before the committee in 2012. It's the same statements that we're addressing here. And there are some concerns with the completeness and accuracy of those statements. In fact, the Accountant General and myself had a discussion as late as just before this meeting as to how to proceed with that, and I'll allow her to update the committee on that. But substantively, it relates to shareholdings by the government of Jamaica that should be reflected in the name of the Accountant General. And we're concerned that there may be overstatement, stroke understatement in some issues because the value of these shares are not fully represented in the statements. Either they are, and we're concerned about the value at which they are disclosed at, or they are not reflected at all. And that particular matter is 3.288 and 3.289. Thank you.
In the prompt, there's a 3.281, which is outstanding. You didn't mention that one. AG, I'm not sure.
Yes, Mr.
Yeah.
That's really a general statement relating to the weaknesses that surrounds the preparation of all the statements. And again, reiterating the fact that this issue is really recurring. The Accountant General has been before the PAC before, addressing matters of this nature, and my concern is that steps may be taken to address the issue at the time, but it is not continued and reflected in the subsequent statements or practices.
Right, okay. And the the one 3.288 is ranked as a keep in view rather than outstanding, but you mentioned it in your opening because you think it's, yeah.
Yes. That's the matter that the Accountant General, yesterday when I reviewed it, I was of the view that I would await the outcome of the steps taken by the Accountant General. And then I had reason to review it this morning, and we had a discussion emanating out of it. And I thought that based on the discussion between herself and myself, I thought it best that she actually explains to the committee what she will do.
Thank you. All right. Well, we can start then, I think, with 3.2.75, which is the first item in the prompt that is ranked as being outstanding, and it is to do with 14 appropriation accounts for the Accountant General's Department that were not submitted. Pension and public debt heads for the financial years 11-12 to 16-17, as required by the Financial Administration and Audit Act. And in these periods, Parliament approved budgetary allocations of approximately $953.6 billion to these heads over that period. And there's a response in the prompt from management, and management's response is that their records show that a response was done on October 27th last year with regard to statement F. It's not clear whether the response was delivered to the Auditor General's Department, so it's resent, and I apologize for not submitting the other responses earlier. And the Accountant General's Department executes expenditures under these heads on instructions from the Ministry of Finance, the Accountant General's Department will continue to undertake the necessary research and complete the statements for submission by September of this year. So, Madam Accountant General, can you just give us an indication of what is the cause of the delay in submitting these 14 appropriation accounts? And perhaps you could introduce yourself too, ma'am. Yes.
We are in dialogue with we're in liaison with the Minister of Finance to help us finalize these statements. There are the statements have been done, but there are certain
all right,
focus points that need to be put in the statement that we are awaiting.
Okay, if I may.
The microphone doesn't seem to be on or working. But it's not generating any sound.
Okay, with respect to, for instance, the debt reports, my understanding is that the explanations that were previously given were not satisfactory. They were too general, so they were requesting more detailed explanations, and we are working on those. I think we have, for instance, some related to 12-13 for the debt reports. 12-13 would have been the year when the national debt exchange occurred, and that is largely the reason for most of the variances from what was budgeted, but we are putting the responses together and we'll be submitting them to the Accountant General in short order.
Chair, if I may.
Yes,
AG, correct me if I'm wrong, you indicated that this is a continuation of what was coming over from last year's report. Whereas I understand it's from 2011, 2012 that this has not been done. Have we made any progress since last year's report and this year's report in respect of what you want here?
Substantially, no. And I can share
if that is the case, then AG, other AG, and FS, what guarantees and assurances that can be given to this committee that the statement in the prompt that by September 2018 we will have these, what assurances will we have, what guarantees will we have, how can we be comforted by this particular statement?
well, you were going to say something, ma'am.
Yes, Mr. Chair. And I can say that this matter is before the committee because the auditors are earnestly trying to avoid a qualification, or they were trying to avoid a qualification of the statement based on the response that I have received from the Accountant General, the instruction that I gave, and I advised the Accountant General as much this morning, that the statements will be qualified. We have had these statements for too long, and we need to dispatch with them. And so whatever corrections will be made or have to be made will have to be reflected in a statement of a later year. So really what it will say is that I will qualify my opinion to say that I cannot rely on the information and therefore cannot say that the statements have been prepared in keeping with the relevant provision.
So just so I understand what we're actually talking about, that these statements were submitted, but there were balances in them that were inconsistent with some other information that you had, or what was the issue really?
Yes, and it goes either way. Either the balances are reflected, or we have information that there are shares held by other government entities that should be held in the name of the Accountant General's Department that is not reflected.
This is a shares issue we're talking about here too?
About the first one, the appropriation.
The appropriation. Oh, we are still at the appropriation account. My apologies. Yes, no, I'm getting it confused. I'm speaking to statement F. Right, so that's a different issue. So yes, we are waiting, as it pertains to the appropriation account, we're waiting for the clarification.
And what are we seeking to clarify? That, I mean, they would have in relation to, say, the debt, is this to do with the interest payments that have been made and the amount of them vis-a-vis
The budget.
other, I mean, I'm just trying to understand what gives rise to the query. Is it that there's some inconsistency between what they have presented and what you have on the other side from another source, or is it that something is missing, or there haven't been any supporting documents to substantiate what they have reflected in the statement? What is the real source of the reason why, the source of this problem? Or is it that they just haven't submitted the accounts as it stated? They just haven't
They just have not submitted those accounts.
Sorry, the accounts, Madam Auditor, they were in fact submitted, but the responses, we were told by the auditors, were vague and general. And so we had to get to specifics, and so we are waiting further information from our stakeholders.
Just to clarify, Chair, we were asked to provide explanations for the variances between the actual and the budget. The initial responses that were provided, the Auditor General indicated that they were too general and they needed more specifics. So that is what we are in the process of preparing to provide. But the balances themselves, there were no issues with those.
All right. Well, I hope that we will not have to have this issue before us again. Mm-hmm. And you've indicated you'll try to resolve it by September. Mm-hmm. So, explaining variances in debt payments and so on, you know, the ministry should be in a position to provide that information. So,
yes, we are.
Yeah. All right. Perhaps we could move on unless anybody else wants to say anything on that issue. The next one is flagged, so to speak, as being outstanding is 3.2.81, which is focusing on financial management weaknesses that had been covered in previous reports. Yes.
Well, can I ask, in relationship to 3.2.75, is it customary that so many years are outstanding at any one time? Because this is from 2011 to 2016, 2017.
It's just that the details of the appropriation accounts have not been provided. The information has not been provided at the detailed level.
No, but don't you audit every year?
Right, so the appropriation accounts have in fact been prepared every year. Mm-hmm. However, the responses requested have not been satisfactory. So it's not that the accounts themselves were not prepared.
So in other words, the statements were prepared. The Auditor General's Department, which do random sampling or random audits, looked at them and was not satisfied with the explanations as to what was behind these variances between the actual figures and the budgeted figures, and asked for more granular detail as to substantiate why there were these variances, and that has not been provided, so they haven't been able to sign off on them.
Right.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, pardon me, I just want clarification. Is it your internal auditor that reviewed the statement and identified discrepancies?
They reviewed the statements as well.
Fine. So it was not submitted to the Auditor General's Department?
It was. They were.
No, we have not received those statements.
All right,
No.
can we check on that?
We can check on
Chair?
that.
With the
But
internal-
our record,
May I ask a question here? How often do we have this situation where agents in the department say they have submitted to the Auditor General, and the Auditor General Department is saying they don't receive them? We had the same thing last time we were here with the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation as it relates to roads maintenance fund. How often do we have this problem? And how credible are these concerns? How credible are these reports? Because I've been getting it for over the years. It's not the first time we've having this, where agencies and departments advise us that they have submitted what is required to the AG's department. And yet, reports come here expressing concerns, even though the queries were responded to. And reports that we get give the impression that the agencies and departments did not respond or give any reasonable or credible response to the question asked. It is happening too often with agencies and departments. This is the second time. In the second we have met here, this 2 times in successions. And over the years we have had this. Something we need to look into this thing to understand what is happening.
Well, in this instance, there seems to be a disconnect because the Auditor General's department are indicating that these particular statements were not submitted. The ministry, and the question was asked, were they reviewed by an internal auditor? The Accountant General said, yes, that may be so, but the statements were submitted, yes. And the FSS said they need to look into this to resolve that issue. I don't know how much further we can take it at this point.
Chair, my information is that the reports were submitted to the auditors, external auditors, year after year, but because the responses were vague, they did not accept them. They were not accepted. They were in fact submitted but not accepted.
When you say the responses were vague,
because we
you submit the statements are submitted. What responses are you referring to?
Well, for instance, we will say the increase or the decrease was caused by this, but that was just a general response. So the auditors need to know that the increase or the decrease was caused by a foreign exchange movement in the pound, in the krona, in whatever, with the specific details of the foreign exchange transactions that would have caused the variance.
Mr. Chair, it is my understanding that a requirement of the appropriation accounts is that the explanations are provided, and therefore I guess if the explanations were not clear, they were not accepted.
So when you submit the statements, you're supposed to submit them with explanations of the variances. And the explanations that were submitted were not satisfactory.
Yes.
And they have not yet been clarified to the satisfaction of the Auditor General.
They have not yet been clarified.
Yeah. Yes.
See, now we're seeing this occurrence from time to time where one agency is reporting that they have submitted documents to the Auditor General. The Auditor General is saying that they have not received the documents. Is there a system in place that verifies from either side when the documents are submitted?
Do you have a register of what's been submitted?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, let me say, I'll be bold to say that this is not a regular occurrence. If that was the case, 8 entities would be here this morning. In fact, the Accountant General has 16 issues, and I've only identified 3. The others have been resolved. I had a discussion with the Accountant General as late as this morning, and I asked her, I gave her the opportunity to provide me with any issue or matter that she believes that we have not satisfactorily addressed the issue or there is a variance. She was given an opportunity by me on Friday, and it is the first time that I've done that, and I did that because of the situation that happened at the last sitting of the PAC, which I will come back to the PAC on, but I gave her an opportunity to present additional information. Hence, there was a correction yesterday. For this particular matter, it is said that it was presented to the auditors. Is it that the statements were shown to the auditors when they were at the Accountant General's department and they had an opportunity to review it and to say it is not satisfactory? Because that is not submission. Submission is sending it to the Auditor General's department, and it must be recorded in our registry. That's the evidence. But I know that oftentimes when the auditors are in the field, the accountant may use that opportunity to either show the statement and ask for consent. Can we accept this? And it is possible at that point in time they say it is not satisfactory, and so it is not submitted. So I am not, as you can see, there is a disconnect here, but at the Auditor General's department, the registry does account for it. There's no evidence of it coming through.
Okay, thank you for that explanation. So FS, yes, I would just leave it in your hands, ma'am, if you would be, just to ensure that this matter is attended to with alacrity and a sense of urgency, and that the necessary granular explanations for all the variances which have not been satisfactorily explained so far are provided so that we can get closure on these financial statements.
Yes, sir, will do.
Perhaps we can move on now then to the next one, which was the management weaknesses. And what is said here is that the findings substantiate that the Accountant General's Department has done very little to address the prevailing deficiencies in the preparation of the statements of the Consolidated Fund. And the response given here is that a number of our statements carry year-long balances. Documentation spanning as many as 3 decades cannot be located, and as such, opening balances can't be confirmed. Whilst the current year information in the statements is correct, the auditors are unwilling to approve the statement due to the uncertainty of the opening balances. And it goes on to say the Ministry of Finance will continue its investigation, prepare instructions to grandfather these opening balances through discussions with the Auditor General. Okay. Again, maybe a little background would help clarify what we're talking about here. This is a separate set of issues now to what we were just discussing, I assume. And it's to do with opening balances for various accounts which have not been verified. So what are we discussing here? What's opening balances for what? Do we know?
These statements go back to the year 1988. And what has happened is that a number of these statements carry year-long balances. And in relocations over the years, over the decades, the Accountant General was not able to locate these documents to substantiate the opening balances. And so while we prepare these statements every year, and the yearly statements are correct, because the carry-forward opening balances cannot be verified by the auditors, they have not been authenticated.
Now, given the longevity of this situation, it seems highly unlikely that you're going to ever be able to verify those opening balances.
Yes.
Please correct me if I'm wrong.
You're correct.
But if I'm correct, then I think we need to resolve this by a decision, and I'm not sure how that decision would be made, but between the FS and the Auditor General, as it says here, maybe there can be a discussion as to how we can bring closure to it rather than having this going on ad infinitum into the future. I don't know whether there's some decision that needs to be formally made to accept the opening balances as is, even though they're not verifiable. I don't know what the ways of resolving this, but it can't, I suppose, be allowed to continue. So next century, we'll be still discussing this in the Public Accounts Committee. Well, we won't be, but our successors, heirs and successors, yeah.
Yes, Mr. Chairs, and I'll go back to the statement that I made earlier that my decision is that I'll qualify the statements. The challenge is that the statements will be qualified going forward because there are balances included in the closing balances that we will not be able to verify. And so I can't give an opinion on the current year balances only, but the final balances. So until the Ministry of Finance, and that's really the responsibility of the Ministry of Finance as to what it will do with those balances, whether it's write-off, I really don't know what decision they will make. But certainly from an audit standpoint, I will have to qualify on the basis that the statements are not accurate.
And that qualification would be carried forward from year to year?
It would, because those balances will still exist in the balance. So even though the current year balances can be verified, the final balances will contain elements that we are unable to verify. But in trying to have this matter resolved, as you see, it is going on. So we will have to dispense with the matter on our end, and the Ministry of Finance will have to then make a decision as to how it will be treated with going forward.
Yeah, it does seem, I don't know what the solution is for this, FS, but it does speak to here about grandfathering, speaks here about grandfathering the opening balances, grandfather in quotes. I don't know what grandpa will do, but it's important that, you know, he works his magic and sorts this out, because it would be a very unsatisfactory situation that we're going to have the accounts of a critical department within the Ministry of Finance, which is the paymaster, the accountant general, having their accounts qualified. I don't know, is this all of the statements for the department as a whole, or are we talking about a specific subset of statements that would do you know what we're talking about here?
It's not odd.
Quite a few. Some of them are.
No, it's not all. I think statement E and D,
And J.
which one has to do with advances from the console fund? Right. Okay.
So it's a particular subcategory of
subset,
transactions that we're talking, types of category of transactions.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
And we have the FS here. Can we get a guarantee that this will be dealt with, and if she can explain how can it be dealt with, because this has been rolling over for quite a time. And I mean, you know, she's here with us now, so can we get a guarantee that this will be dealt with?
Yeah, yes.
To follow up on Member Phillips' question, I mean, and this is to the Auditor General. I mean, I'm not an accountant, but is there anything in the various different acts that allows for, after a period of time, because this is going on from 1988, right, for almost a stop and start situation where at some point in time the information is in fact correct, and that skewed balance is not kept continually brought over in subsequent period.
The process is a question of verification, I think, rather than saying it's right or wrong. I mean, it's just that there's a balance included in the current balance, which is being carried back from way back, which they haven't been able to say, this is in fact how that balance was arrived at. Yeah. And in terms of how you bring closure to it, is your question, is there any statutory provision that would allow that? Yeah.
Mr. Chair? I think the Ministry of Finance would want to have some further discussions with the Accountant General before she qualifies the statement. Auditor, sorry, General, just to see what other possibilities there might be in terms of addressing
Madam,
this issue.
could you point the mic a little closer?
Sorry. So I'm just saying that the Ministry of Finance would want to have some further discussions with the Auditor General to see what other possibilities there might be before any qualification is done, and how we would move forward, because certainly we would not want to have this qualification following us.
What are the implications for you, FS, or for Jamaica, of having these accounts qualified? Are there any implications in terms of any of our international agreements or donor agreements, or is it just a question of not being tidy?
Yeah, it really would not be tidy. I don't think there would be a major implication, but it's not something we would want to happen. Mm-hmm.
Chairman, the question you posed earlier in relation to whether there were subsets that take on the qualification, I'm not sure that that when we're looking at international best practices, we can decide that a subset has to be qualified and not the entire accounts. And perhaps the AG can guide along this path. And where the FS is saying that it may not have any significant implication, and the global corruption index is hovering, you know, just like the sword of Damocles, it's just about to fall on somebody's head. For us to have something being traversed over what period, from 1980, 88, I mean, it certainly doesn't give a true impression of us doing all that is within our powers to correct these practices. I mean, it's bad.
Okay, but we would not have any issues with the current balances. It's not that the current balances are not verified. It is going back where the issues would have arisen.
Chairman, I'm not sure that what FS is saying is can be taken, to say that the current balances have been verified in the absence of having the historical figures looked at. And how do we do that? Is that what is in international accounting practice? Is that an acceptable position? How do you...
Clearly it isn't. I think FS's point is that the current transactions are verified, but the opening balances which are carried, which would feed through into the closing balances and become the opening balances of the next year and feed through, if you go back and back and back, the original balances, which are still part of the current balance because they flow right through from year to year, those were not satisfactorily verified. Back.
Okay.
Yeah.
Misuse of terms, sir. Transactions, the current transactions are verified.
Mr. Chairman, while the current transactions are verified, and we're happy about that, what the AG is saying, she has to qualify the accounts generally. And that is where the problem, because when international partners are looking at the accounts, they might not dig deep into sections. Once they see a qualification, then that is where the issue maybe comes in.
Chairman.
This is why I asked the question, what are the implications of it? The FS hasn't identified any specific concern other than the fact that the ministry's accounts, which include these, would have some statements which are qualified by the Auditor General. And given that it's the Ministry of Finance we're talking about, it's not a good signal to send. That's Chairman. To the state of accounting within the government, within the public service. Yeah.
And that's why, Chair, it disturbs me that the response from the FS at this point in time, when this is coming back from so far, that, and I know she's new in the job, but it should not be something that we're going to look at again. It is something that should have been dealt with a long time ago, because this is coming from 1988. And I mean, FS, I can't accept that, no, it is something that we're going to discuss again. It's not acceptable.
I think the Accountant General indicated that some of the problems have arisen from the fact they have moved on more than one occasion over this protracted period, and some of the records may not be, they can't find them. I don't know what the problems are. You're talking about decades or so, these things can arise. But there must be a methodology, though, for solving it. So, because it can't be that we're going to have these statements going out into the future qualified every year, so that some situation has to be resolved, some solution has to be found that would satisfy the Auditor General that she can sign off on it as being, closed in a way that is appropriate. Member Guy.
Chairman, I'm not versed in accounting except as it relates to my salary, as far as I go. But AG, what if you were to, in terms of the statements for the respective years, to qualify 89 with that particular thing, would that affect the subsequent years?
Yes, because the balances are running. Mm-hmm. So those balances from 88 make up the opening balances and the closing balances. So as the Accountant General has said, we're able to verify the current year balances, but not the total balance.
All right. Having said that, the chairman threw out a suggestion which has not been answered. If eventually we may not find those accounts for 1988, what's the route to resolution?
I think it's best for the Ministry of Finance to provide that response.
In some instances, the statute of limitations provides a solution, depending on the particular issue. Because it may be that something can be written off because it's no longer recoverable or something like that. But I don't know if that's relevant here or not. Yeah. But FS, you don't sound like you're in a position to give us a solution now.
I would like to look at it and have discussion with the Auditor General, and we will come back with a resolution.
What I would ask is if you could have that discussion at an early date while our minds are still fresh on this issue, and perhaps submit in writing to the committee where you have reached. If we could have that, I would say, what's a reasonable period of time, committee, to have a response from them on that issue? Would you say 30 days?
Mr. Chairman, before we reach them, I'm taken aback somewhat by the Financial Secretary response that you look at it and have discussion with the AG. This is from 88.
Yeah, but
We shouldn't be looking at it now. I expect that question, what? I expect that question being asked, there would have been already answer to it. Than to say at this stage, we'll look at it and have discussion. We can't, from 88. So a decision ought to be taken long ago. Or we reach at a point where we can, the ministry will say, this is where we are and this is what we're going to do. But we can't wait until so many years. How much year that is now?
Well, we are
30 years, and so we're just going to look at it now? It's unacceptable.
It's unacceptable, but we are where we are, and I'm just asking to have a resolution brought to bear and a report given to us within 30 days. If the report is that it's still unresolved, we'll ask it. We'll continue to ask for an update every 30 days on this issue, because it's dragged on far too long and it needs to be put to bed.
Did you get an answer on if it affects any of our...
Yes, the answer was that, and this was an extempore answer off the cuff, but the answer was, as far as the FS was aware at the time, she couldn't think of any sort of definite negative implication that this would trigger, such as us being in breach of some covenant in some loan agreement or something. But it's untidy. Maybe that, with further thought, other implications could be considered. Somebody mentioned how we rank in the Transparency and Anti-Corruption Index, as an issue, but the FS hasn't pointed to a specific negative consequence that will flow from the qualification of the accounts. But I would say that it's certainly, from a private sector perspective, if an entity's accounts are qualified, that certainly if they're a borrower, that is an issue which can trigger even the calling of a loan if you have a well-documented loan agreement. So, I'm not sure in the public sector sphere whether that's the sort of thing that would be of concern, but we want to resolve this. So within 30 days, if we could have a written report as to where you've reached in the resolution, and we'll take it from there. Hopefully, at that point, we can say, well done. From 1988, it's finally been solved. Okay. But we don't know, because the Auditor General will have to be satisfied that the solution is workable. All right?
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Can we move on to the next item relates to share certificates. Essentially, the prompt is saying that shares, 128 ordinary shares valued at $17,000+ and 25 million preference shares were not in the name of the Accountant General, in keeping with the Financial Administration Audit Act, the Crown Property Vesting Act, and Cabinet Instruction. They were instead issued in the names of public officials and entities. And there was a response from management indicating the source of the problem as having been prior to 2004 and the New Companies Act, not so new now. Single-member companies were not allowed. In those days, a company had to have at least 2 shareholders, which is no longer a requirement. But as a result of that requirement, there were times when shares were held in the names of directors and CEOs in conjunction with the Auditor General. And there's been a tidying up process to transfer shares that are held in other names into the name of the Accountant General. And the efforts have been assisted and enhanced by the Cabinet Office, where instructions have been given to have all shares held outside the sole ownership of the Accountant General transferred forthwith. And the status and verification column says that on May 18th of this year, the Accountant General presented evidence to indicate that accounting officers of MDAs and CEOs of government companies were advised to transfer shares as instructed by Cabinet in 2015. Because this, I recall when this came up when I was in Cabinet, and there's a proliferation of companies out there that are owned by the government, either in whole or in part, and where shares were in the names of persons who are no longer in the public service or died, and so on. Resolving these issues from a legal perspective can be tedious, but it's very important that it be done. And it's very important that we get away from the practice of having shares that are held on behalf of the publics. And those shares should be held in accordance with the Crown Property Vesting Act, where personality owned by the government must be vested in the Accountant General, real estate in the Commissioner of Lands. And that is a basic bifurcation of ownership of public assets. And that needs to be pursued, and the necessary legwork done by the MD&As to have it done. And I think just bringing it up here again is just another opportunity to reinforce that this tidying up exercise needs to be executed with seriousness by the relevant ministries and the departments and agencies under their portfolios. Madam Accountant General, perhaps you could give us an update on this from your perspective.
Okay. Certainly during my time in 2012 and before my time, the records will show that we have been using our best efforts to get all the MDAs, all government bodies out there that have shareholding, in which the GOJ has shareholding, that the shares are titled in the name of the Accountant General. As you've said, Chairman, the process is slow and tedious. We have on file where we would have written one entity 12, 13, 14 times, and the responses just are not coming. The responses are coming in, but they are coming in very, very slowly. In 2012, we wrote to all the entities advising that where there are shares held by them that are held in other directors or other persons' name, that these shares should be surrendered or transferred to the Accountant General. We never got a good traction. Later, I think it was in 2013, that a letter was issued by the Cabinet Office advising all PSs that all shares held by their ministry departments and other entities held in other names than the Accountant General should be transferred. That helped us a bit, but still there are a number of shares out there that still needs to be transferred. It is not that these entities have not been contacted. They have been contacted, but the responses have been very slow, and the share transfers have been very slow as well. In 2013 as well, we had written to these entities to have them advise us by way of a confirmation what percentage shareholdings they have, the GOJ have in their companies. Whether it's a preference shareholding, ordinary shareholding, whatever it was. We did this because we wanted to update our share registers. And we got some responses from the various entities. Now, when we got the responses and we compared them what we have in-house, there were differences in terms of the shareholding. So, for instance, an entity might say we have 10 shares belonging to the GOJ, but our records might be showing 10, might be showing 12 or 8. In those cases, because we don't have the physical evidence, we include that in the statements by way of a note. We do not bring it into the main body of the financial accounting. Now, in discussion with the Auditor General this morning, as she has said, she says once the shares are confirmed by a third-party entity, then those should be brought to accounts, even in the absence of evidence of the share certificate. So on that, from that discussion, I have said to the Director of Shares, please, going forward, include all that has been confirmed by the entities in the financial statement, regardless of whether or not we have the physical evidence. So that will be done.
Could I just ask you, where the government owns a company outright, 100%, or a controlling interest of over 50%, is the responsibility for the maintenance of the share register of that company and the issuing of certificates and all the administrative requirements of the Companies Act in relation to that company, is that a responsibility that is reposed within the Accountant General's office as the holder of those shares, or is it a responsibility that lies elsewhere within the particular MD&A that that company falls within?
That responsibility lies within the MDA, with the MDA that holds those shares. So in other words, they will have secretaries, legal secretaries, board secretaries, who are responsible for these shareholdings in those companies.
The thing is that the diligence of those persons will vary from individual to individual. Their knowledge of the requirements of the Companies Act will also vary. And so you inherit problems where the necessary filings or paperwork has not been done, and you are supposed to reflect the ownership in your accounts. There's some critical document evidencing that which you don't have, and therefore you don't have accounts which accurately reflect what the government in fact owns. And it seems to me that this is something which, from a policy perspective, maybe ought to be considered, that because you hold so many shares in so many entities, maybe it ought to be that you are responsible for maintaining the share registers of those entities, and you can ensure that they're done properly across government, rather than relying on outlying agencies to be diligent in what they do in this regard. It's just a thought, but you want them in the Philips.
Yeah, no, but is it that you're bringing all of them under one repository to be able to manage and control all these various entities that have shares for the government?
The shares by law,
yeah,
the shares need to be in the name of the Accountant General,
right?
Who holds shares on behalf of the government
of Jamaica.
And often, more often than not, the government is going to be the majority shareholder, if not the 100% shareholder of that company. But the company may be set up for something in the energy sector or in the transportation sector or some other portfolio. And officers within those portfolios are responsible for maintaining the share register, filing the annual returns at company's office, preparing the share certificates and having them signed, all that sort of thing. But the shares are actually legally held by the Accountant General. And my point was, given the discrepancies that have existed over many years in this area, whether it might not be a good idea to have a sort of central...
No, that's the point I'm making.
Central registrar of company,
for all government shares.
For government shares, which would be a little unit that would be responsible for ensuring, and would have the expertise to know that every single company is up to date, the filings are up to date, and the things are properly documented.
Yeah. So two, before you go, Mr. Campbell, two questions. Are we going to be moving in that direction? And secondly, again, Chairman, and I keep speaking to the Auditor General over there. Too often we hear ministers and agencies come to committees like this talking about writing to, and I didn't get your name.
Yes, sorry.
Carleen Murdoch.
Sorry?
Carleen
Murdoch. Sorry.
All right.
And who's the lady to your left, FS?
Oh, sorry, Sheila Wang, Principal Finance Officer of the Ministry of Finance.
All right. But are there sanctions for those permanent secretaries or accounting, whoever it is that we write to in these ministries, that do not respond? Because to write to 13 times or 12 or 18 times is probably... It's
a colossal waste of time.
No, it is, but are there sanctions, though, Chair? Because there has to be, because if you, I always say that if we continue to run government, if it was a private entity, that person would either be fired or the business gone out of business. We're gone out of business, and we can't continue to treat the public's business in a manner like that. So, can somebody answer me? Are there sanctions for these individuals?
I'm not aware of any sanctions. However, the Accountant General is in fact supposed to be the registry for all government-held shares.
No, but then
There's misconduct in a public office, because for the life of me, I cannot understand why the cabinet would have issued instructions to an entity and that entity refuses to carry out those lawful instructions. So that must amount to misconduct in a public office.
Yes.
Not only is it wrong, it's a criminal offense.
But if my memory served me well, there ought to be sanctions for public officers who are found in breach of and it is the Ministry of Finance that basically hand down these sanctions. You know,
I believe there are provisions for sanctions.
Yes.
What they ought to say that they don't enforce the sanctions, but there are provisions for sanctions.
And what it said
but
to
they
me
don't
is,
carry through.
Yeah, and what it said to me is that we're just not taking the public's business seriously, because you can't be writing to one entity 18 times. It should not be.
And this includes
Can I-
telephone calls as well.
Sorry, can I respond, please? The government is in the process of a public sector transformation. Included in that transformation is the addressing of all of these public bodies and what should or should not be done with them. We have, in fact, as a part of that, been trying to update the registry of shares. We will certainly be going forward now in terms of not writing again, but actually having persons interface with the relevant entities to ensure that the share registries are properly updated. In terms of the sanctions, there have to be specific breaches for sanctions to be implemented. I would need to check, hence the indication that I am not aware of a sanction for the specific thing that we have been speaking about.
Madam FS, I am not comforted by that, because if we treat the first issue from 1988 till now, and the answer you gave, and then coming to this now, believe me, let me just say this, and this is not to do with the personality. If an entity is written 18 times and asked to respond, and it was said that the cabinet office had to write, you got some response, but you're not. And I don't think we need to wait until a public sector transformation. It is just information that is requested by the Accountant General for an activity that is to be done. And if individuals within ministries, departments, or agencies are not responding, then if it was my private entity, I would have fired their backside long time. I would have done it, but and I tell you, it gives me no comfort when we keep on talking about trying to get government to a certain point, and you have persons within. And we shouldn't be sitting here, and I'm sick and tired of coming here and hearing the same thing over and over. I feel like it's a waste of my time.
FS, did you say that there's going to be there is a centralization of the corporate secretarial function for government-owned companies within the Accountant General's department?
Right. It actually exists at the Accountant General's department. It has not been properly updated, as you are discussing. So we are now in the process of ensuring that all the relevant information is obtained, that it is updated, and that going forward, there are certainly policies in place with respect to how these things are handled.
Well, Chairman, well, I hope if this is so, there are some, apart from just the fact that there's obviously dereliction of duty, there is some sanction that is also placed going forward to ensure that this sort of situation just doesn't occur, because I agree with Member Phillips, I mean, just gives me no comfort any at all.
Okay, so there would be varying reasons why we are where we are today. As indicated earlier, what existed prior to a certain date was that 100% of the company could not be held, legally, could not be held by one individual or person, meaning the government could not, and therefore at least one share in time gone by was being placed in someone's name other than the accountant general. And that is part of the problem which we have been trying to resolve for several years. And we will seek to ensure that it is resolved.
Madam Auditor General, you wanted to say something?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to just to provide a context in which I made a recommendation to the Accountant General this morning. Now, what the Accountant General said that she wrote to the entities, and in some instances, I can't say exactly how many, the entities did respond, and they provided information on the amount of shares that they are holding. The Accountant General has not recognized that, and I asked her why. She said because she did not have the evidence. I told her that from an audit standpoint, third-party evidence is the strongest form of evidence. But not only that, we were able to identify and to reconcile what the entities said by looking at their financial statements. I told the Accountant General that that should form the basis of, one, acknowledging that these shares apparently do exist, and two, to contact the auditors who formed an opinion on those financial statements as how were they able to satisfy themselves. If an unqualified opinion was issued, they must have satisfied themselves as to the nature of these shares and the fact that they do exist. So you have a basis on which, but she says she doesn't have the physical evidence. My opinion is that you do have some form of evidence because the entities have responded, and even if they have not responded, request their financial statements. And many of those entities do have financial statements. They may be dated, but that does not affect the shares because they would have recognized the shares. And so acknowledge that the shares exist and do further investigations to find out the basis on which they are disclosing that they hold these shares, investigate it and resolve the difference.
But also, Companies Office of Jamaica, every company is obliged to file an annual return.
And we were able to verify by visiting the website of the Companies Office that these shares were being declared on COJ's website.
Chairman.
So, I mean, as long as if they're declared in an annual return, that surely should be sufficient to recognize them in the financial statements. Yeah, even if the company secretary has not been diligent in producing and signing off on a share certificate. Yeah.
Chairman, the AG would probably recognize that I have sat on this committee, though not continuously, since 2002, the latter part of 2002. And what I find a little, it's a tragedy, but it's almost like a travesty too, is that the Auditor General's report, from my understanding, is usually substantially completed by July, September of the previous year, of the year before it is submitted. Public officials, MDAs, have the opportunity to respond to the Auditor General so that when the report is completed and submitted to the Parliament, there is some understanding between the Auditor General and those entities. So at least they might not be brought to book before the Public Accounts Committee. But I find it a little strange, lackadaisical, almost cavalier, thank you, that some of these issues are resolved the day before, the morning after of the meeting, to try and give the committee the view that something is being acted upon. It cannot continue like this, Chairman. It doesn't matter which administration in the public sector. This seems to be the status quo, and the sort of laissez-faire approach to managing the affairs of the country cannot be allowed to continue. Questions were asked earlier on what sanctions exist and whether these sanctions are being utilized in terms of bringing to books the officers and the officials who do not do what they're supposed to do. I find it a little strange that the Auditor General just now has indicated that they were able, in their own investigation, to go on the company's office website to find out about these shares. Secondly, the external auditors for the Accountant General's Department, for the investment, the companies, right, were able to have a satisfactory response that these exist. But at the same time, the Accountant General's Department is not able to find and satisfy.
The issue is the Accountant General's Department is saying they will recognize their ownership in shares when they have a physical document to evidence that ownership, which is the normal thing is a share certificate, unless they are shares that are listed in a depository, which would be a listed company situation. But most of these are not listed companies, so they were looking for a share certificate. The Auditor General is looking at the substance of the ownership, because the asset exists and it should be reflected in the financial statements. And our point is, you can verify that that asset exists in ways other than a physical share certificate. For one, if the underlying company that you own shares in has audited financial statements with shareholders' equity and share capital, which is there in it, somebody must own it. Company's office would show the returns would show who the shareholders are. So it may just be that the share certificate itself, for some reason or other, has not been produced or they don't have it, but that doesn't mean that they don't own the shares. So I think that is the point.
A follow-up question to AG. Not many are profitable. But those that may be profitable, who gets that dividend?
Government.
I really don't want to hazard a guess by answering that at this point in time. I believe the financial secretary is the best person to respond to that.
The government of Jamaica.
Even if the share is listed in an individual's name?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
That individual would be a nominee.
Right.
Or trustee for the government. So for them to receive those funds and hold them for their own account would be a fraud, and they would be prosecutable for that.
Mr. Chairman, just to follow up on what Member Guy said earlier on, he expressed his concern of the presentation here and that the questions reached the AG the day before or the day we're coming here. I too have been serving on this committee for a long time. My first stint started in 1980. I came back to Parliament in 2002 and I've been serving since. But the issue here that I've been speaking of on the several chairpersons or chairmen of this committee, you, Member Davis, Member Phillips, Member Shaw, since I came back here, and that has to do with the preparedness of the persons who appear before this committee. In most cases, they are not prepared, and we have already sent them back to prepare and come back here because what they're presenting was an insult to this committee. And it's still reoccurring, you know, it's reoccurring. The preparedness of the persons appearing before this committee, and I'm not too sure that this team today is really prepared, because question that we can't get straightforward question to, and we're getting part answers and, you know, straightforward answers. It demonstrates clearly of the, how should I put it now, the lackadaisicalness with the approach with it, and the disrespect of the committee, or the importance of the committee. And this is why officers are unprepared. And I'm prepared, I'm willing to go back to those stages when they come here and cannot give us satisfactory answers. that we ask them to go prepare and come back in 2 weeks, or we set a date for them to come back. But it does make sense. We've been, coming here to represent the people, and the type of answers we are getting from the officers, it's unacceptable, totally unacceptable, and we need to go back to those old days.
There's one specific issue I wanted to ask you about, and this concerns Air Jamaica. In the prompt, there's a reference to a situation involving shares in Air Jamaica, which should have been transferred to the government at the time that Air Jamaica Limited was reorganized. As I understand it, the government of Jamaica owns 16%, I think, or something like that, in what is now currently called Caribbean Airways, arising from a transaction where the assets, certain assets of Air Jamaica, were taken over by what was then BWI, I think, and it was rebranded as Caribbean Airways. And Jamaica has a residual equity interest in that and a board seat, if my memory serves me correctly. And I just want to be assured that our equity in that entity is properly documented and that the Accountant General has the share certificate or share certificates to evidence that ownership. The previous entity, which was insolvent, I think is in the process of being dissolved, if it hasn't been dissolved already. But the live entity is Caribbean Airways. And the other point I wanted to make was in an era where we're looking at privatizations and consolidations and mergers and so on, the share ownership of companies is important. And that is why I would recommend that for as a policy, any company that is a subsidiary of the government, owned by the government, substantially owned by the government, the responsibility for ensuring that the company's records, corporate records, are properly maintained, the necessary filings are done, the registers are written up, certificates are duly issued. That ought to be housed in the Accountant General's department with staff by somebody who knows what they're doing about this, because it's a specialized field. There are persons in the private sector who provide this as a service, but we don't want to be outsourcing that service. I think there are enough companies in the public sector that we ought to be able to do it properly ourselves. But this fragmented approach to doing it obviously has not worked in the past and is not working now. And I think we ought to have that particular function centralized in a particular place with the necessary expertise there to ensure it's done correctly.
Mr. Chair, with respect to Caribbean Airlines, well, the reference in the Auditor General's report is not to the Caribbean Airlines equity. The 11 years that's mentioned means it is not in relation to Caribbean Airlines. The shares that we have in Caribbean Airlines are in fact recorded by the Accountant General's department. Again, we do want to have some further discussions with the Auditor General with respect to the shares that were referenced, just to get some clarity. The Caribbean Airlines, for instance, was not a merger, and therefore that reference is not to them. You had mentioned the assets just now. What happened with respect to Caribbean Airlines was, for all intents and purposes, it was really our routes that they took and not the assets.
I think they took some assets. I think there were some useful assets that they would have taken at the time, but that's a matter of history.
All right, so during the transition.
Sorry, you turn off the mic there, Mr. Campbell.
During the transition period, they used the assets, but they did not take them. So the assets remained with Air Jamaica, which we have gotten rid of.
Again, I'm not going to argue the point, but yeah, they got the routes and maybe they got some assets for a transition period, and you say they didn't keep any of those assets. I mean, I don't know. There were spares. There were other things of use for planes that they assumed
utilized.
Yeah.
During transition.
All right. Any other questions?
Just on this prompt here on provided by the by you. 3.291 on non-operational entities. As at March 2016, 22 entities holding 4.67 billion or 47% of GOJ ordinary shares, valued at approximately 5.97 billion. And it goes further into the protracted period of winding up some of these entities. And I just wanted to because if you go further down, in the ownership of the shares, which is 3.292, causes funds to be unutilized. But what is the net effect to government's balance sheet really on some of these entities, and how much funds are we talking about in some of these entities that are unutilized as mentioned in this statement here? I don't know who can answer this question. This is the GOJ holding shares in non-operational entities for protracted periods.
It makes reference to the fact that 10 of the 22 entities were being wound up and that the period of
6 to
was
15 years.
very lengthy. But what about the other 12? What about the other 12 entities? If they're non-operational and not being wound up, then what's happening to their assets?
Yeah, I know. And if you go to 3.2.92, it speaks about unutilized funds that are unutilized and recovery of investment.
Okay, thank you. All right, so in effect, what we're saying is that the fact that these amounts are reflected in this statement, they're not in operation, so the statement would in effect be overstated by this amount. And the initial investment, the government would not have gained any return on the initial investment, and as time passes, of course, the investment would continue to diminish.
Is that a question of an impairment and something being written off?
It's more a case of impairment.
Yeah.
I think when you were last here, there was an entity, it's not coming to me, but about funds basically sitting down for a protracted period of time. Yeah? Yeah, well, I'm not sure if it was dormant accounts. It was dormant accounts.
Where there was cash
So
sitting that was not being utilized, but that's not the case here.
Shares.
Right.
Okay.
This is that they have an investment in a company on their books, and that company is no longer operational, and they're carrying this investment, but it's not operational.
But wouldn't in some instances government put monies into these investments?
That should form the basis of the investment in the first place.
Yeah.
Yes.
And why would it take so long to wind up some of these entities? I mean, it's...
The chairman himself had indicated earlier that the legal aspect of it at times is quite tedious and continues for some time. I would ask the Accountant General to share the specific experience with these, why they have taken such an inordinate length of time.
And let me just ask before you answer.
Sir.
Would some of these have to do with like projects when government form a company to deal with say a water project or so? No?
No, we're not.
And at the end of the project, you're basically trying to wind up.
They're not
No?
projects, they're companies.
Okay. These are just companies.
Yes, as indicated earlier, the reason that most of them would have taken so long to wind up is related to legal aspects. Where there are legal issues outstanding, we have been unable to just close them down. We are trying to resolve
These
all
are
the
legal
legal
issues to do with the partners or what?
No.
No?
I mean,
it's a bit
would they be in
I
liquidation?
understand some of them are public claims by employees or other issues.
But this has to do with what, 47% of 22 entities. What happened to the other entities involved? It says here 10 of the 22 entities have been in the process of winding up. So what happened to the other 10?
Okay, so again, we are trying to get some additional information to address the full 22 that is indicated here.
The first sentence is a little confusing in the prompt, though, because it says at March 2016, 22 entities holding 4.67 billion, or 47% of the GOJ ordinary shares. Is it the reverse, though? Is it that the Accountant General had shares in 22 entities, which on its books were valued at 4.67 billion? And is that the way it should have been expressed?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
So could we ask for an update as well on this then, please, FS?
Yes, sir.
You know, what is the status of each of these 22 entities? You know, are any of them in liquidation? Are they just being wound down informally? And what is the reason for the delay in concluding that process?
We can provide you with that.
Thank you very much. Any other questions for the persons before us? If not, I would just thank the Accountant General and the Ministry personnel for coming. We look forward to the follow-up documentation that we've asked for. I'm going to ask the clerk to track that, please, on our behalf. And any other business? There being no other business, the date of the next meeting. We finished with the Ministry of Finance now, I think, other than the follow-up work. So we'll move on to the next. So the 5th of June, which is in a fortnight, I think we're going to move on to the Ministry of Labour and Social Security. All right. Madam Auditor General and your team, thank you very much. And in a fortnight, we'll resume.
Nature and the culture of Oso have flourished together with the grassland. Through the efforts of people who continue to treasure tradition, this 1,000-year-old grassland is being carried forth into the future.
As an inner city youth, I'm a duty to know the laws and my rights. These laws affect all our self-interest and safety.
A true your talk. If you know the laws of the land and do the right thing, then respect due to each and everyone. I know my laws and my rights.